video is going to be the basic disassembly and troubleshooting of your X7 Cyclone feeder system. We're first going to start off by using our 3/16 Allen wrench to remove the feeder bolt from the Cyclone feeder. Once we have that removed, we're going to set that off to the side, and I'm going to flip the marker over. Now we have the X7 Cyclone feeder. I usually just do a visual inspection just to check to make sure that my hoses and my fittings are nice and tight. You want to make sure that the fittings are nice and snug. If not, you'll have a leak, and that may cause your Cyclone feeder to malfunction. Also check to make sure that your hose is nice and tight on the barbed fitting, and also check to make sure that it doesn't have any holes, or make sure that it's not frayed on the end. It'll get frayed on the end from excessive pulling it on and off. So what we'll do now is we'll go ahead, we'll remove the Cyclone feeder from the marker, and you can see how it just slipped right off the barbed fitting. After a number of times doing this, it will flare out the hose, and that'll make it really hard for the hose to stay onto the barbed fitting, and then it'll cause a leak. So we'll go ahead, we'll set the X7 marker off to the side here, and we'll work strictly on the Cyclone feed. Usually I want to start off by looking at the bottom plate. There should be an A towards the bottom of your bottom plate where it meets up with the cylinder. This one has an A1. This is the most current update that we have available for the X7 Cyclone feeder and the A5 Cyclone feeder. If you do not have an A1 on the bottom side of your plate, you want to give us a call and actually get those updates. Another thing we're going to look at is, I'm going to go back to this fitting. You always want to check to make sure that on the back side of your banjo fittings you have your O-ring on there. Now this one's going to be pretty hard to see because it is a black O-ring on a black fitting, so I'll go ahead, I'll disassemble it. Here's the screw, and it does have a hole through it. That's normal. That's going to allow the air to pass through. Then you always want to check to make sure that your hoses and fittings are nice and clear of any kind of dirt or debris. And then you have your O-ring that will be on the back side of the fitting as well. You always want to check to make sure that that's in good shape. It's not frayed or too flat. So we'll kind of set those off to the side for now. You can see kind of the orientation of the paddles. We get a lot of people that flip them upside down and put them in backwards, and I can actually show you how to do that. Go ahead and remove our screw. One thing about this screw, you always want to make sure that the screw's not too tight. If the screw's too tight, it will push the paddles all the way down into the bottom of the feeder housing, and it will restrict it from feeding every single time. A real easy way to pull these paddles out of the Cyclone feeder is to just tap it on your work surface, and then they'll just come right out. Like I was saying about the paddles, we get a lot of people that flip them upside down and reinstall them backwards. You never want your paddle to be looking like that. You can tell that it's upside down because it feeds against the feeder hook. So you'll see that there's some injection points on the bottom side of the paddle. You want to make sure that those are facing downward. And on the top paddle, there's the same injection points. You also want to make sure that those are always facing down. So we'll go ahead and set the paddles off to the side. We'll flip our Cyclone feed back over. I want to talk about the screws a little bit. Sometimes they get over tightened, and that will push the bottom plate up against the ratchet assembly, and it will restrict it from feeding. So you always want to make sure that these screws are just snug. You don't want to over tighten them because it will push the bottom plate up against the feeder ratchet and cause it to malfunction. So we'll go ahead, we'll remove these screws just to kind of take a look at what's going on inside. You want to be careful not to strip those screws out. You could kind of hear the drill skip over the screw. You always want to make sure that you have the correct bit for removing these screws. Kind of set those off to the side. And then usually from there, to remove the bottom plate, you can just kind of lift up on the cylinder. It'll pop right off the top there. Now that you have it off the top, you can see that there's a little backstop on here. When I was talking about the A1 update, we've actually shaved down the backstop to allow the ratchet to move a little further and engage the feeder axle. This is the piece in the center. So we'll set that off to the side for now. Right here you have a feeder ratchet spring. This is actually called the feeder ratchet spring, even though it doesn't really look like a spring. But it is straight, and it is supposed to be bent at the tip like that. That's normal. We get a lot of people that call about it and think that, you know, this is a defect in the product, and that's actually the way it's manufactured. So we'll set that off to the side. You can kind of see where that sits into the housing. I'll go ahead and throw that back in there for you. Kind of see how that sits in the housing there. And then the bent end goes into the axle. So we'll remove that, put that off to the side. From there, you have your Cyclone feeder nut. That's what the Cyclone feeder bolt threads through the receiver of the gun and threads into this piece. You want to be sure not to over tighten it, because what will happen is you will strip out the feeder housing. So we'll go ahead and set that off to the side. From there, you should be able to pull your whole assembly, your ratchet and your feeder axle assembly, out of the feeder housing. So we'll go ahead, we'll put our feeder housing off to the side. Now you have your feeder ratchet assembly and the feeder axle. We'll go ahead and pull that out of the cylinder. We usually get a lot of people that will flip the U-cup seal around the opposite direction. What will happen is, if you have this flared end facing the direction of the feeder housing, you'll get air that will blow past it, and it will not engage the spring. So your Cyclone feed will not operate if your U-cup seal is flipped around backwards. Go ahead and remove our feeder axle.